All right, well, today we're starting a brand new series called Broken Patterns. And spoiler, what we're gonna be doing is talking about some patterns of thinking that can be really unhealthy and can often go totally unaddressed, maybe even uncontended. But to get into it, I want to talk to you about something that I've mentioned here before, if you've been with us for a while. It's something called the Tetris Effect. Anybody remember this, the Tetris Effect? All right, so basically what it is this, there was this study done with a whole bunch of people, and this has been repeated several times. They took people and they made them play Tetris for hours and hours and hours. Now, if you don't know what Tetris is, I don't know where you've been, but it's this game where shapes fall and you gotta fit the shapes into the gaps so that it's like a clean line and then it disappears and you just keep going. So it's shapes and you're trying to find spots for those shapes, where the shapes fit. And so people play Tetris for hours and hours and hours, and what they found is that when they stop playing Tetris and they go back into the real world, without even trying, they find themselves trying to figure out if certain things will fit into certain places. Like they could be in traffic and they'll see two cars in a lane and wonder, could those two cars fit into the two lanes right next to them? Or they'll see books on a shelf and be like, oh, can those books fit in that empty spot over there? Like what they were doing intentionally, they begin to do automatically. And this isn't just something that's unique to the game of Tetris, right? It's not because of the way it's like coded or set up or anything like that. It's because of the way that we're wired. What we do for a while, intentionally, eventually, we start to do automatically. What one person says, the way they define the Tetris effect, they say the Tetris effect occurs when people devote so much time and attention to an activity that it begins to pattern their thoughts, mental images, and even dreams. And so this can apply to other areas of life as well, right? Like if you're a designer, you probably walk into a room and right away you just notice the way that it's set up, if it's designed well, if things are set up symmetrically, if it works, how the colors are, interacting with one another. They've found that lawyers often, you may know this if you're a lawyer, a lot of times lawyers spend so much time trying to pull apart an argument that when they go home, they automatically can sniff out the holes in the arguments of their teenagers and the people that they live with. What they do intentionally, they begin to do automatically. Tom was one of the pastors here. He runs our music and production. I've never seen anyone do this before, okay? Not until I met Tom. But he pays so much attention to the sound of a room. Doesn't matter where we are, what we're doing, what we're talking about. We'll walk into a new environment, and all of a sudden, Tom, out of nowhere, he'll just be like, hold on a second. I'll be like, did you hear that? I'm like, I heard you clap. Right? But he'll pick up the frequency, he'll hum. It's just because he's always paying attention to sound, and he notices it when no one else does. I mean, now I do because he's always mentioning it, but it's what he's learned to do automatically. And so you might be able to figure out where we're going with this. This can work for or against you, right? It's also why you have some friends that when you talk to them, they just seem so interested in you. They're just caring. They ask questions. They remember what you spoke about last time. That's a pattern of thinking. They've gotten used to doing that. Then you may have some other people in your life who do the exact opposite. Not because they're bad people, but they've just gotten used to making things about themselves. It's a pattern. The way that we think intentionally eventually becomes the way that we think automatically. And so we're looking at some of these patterns, some that we don't often give a name to, that might be undermining the relationships in our lives, the way that we see our situations, the way we interact with other people. And ideally, we're hoping to break some of these patterns. You know, what's interesting, and if you're not a person of faith, we're glad you're here, but this might not mean anything to you. But if you are someone who follows Jesus, what's interesting is that the Apostle Paul, who's someone who started a lot of brand new churches, one of the earliest followers of Jesus, someone who wrote a huge chunk of the New Testament, the Jesus part of the Bible, he explained that following Jesus actually starts with changing the way that you think. There's a letter that he wrote. We call it Romans because it was a letter to a church in Rome. And he spends the whole beginning of that letter, like 11 chapters, explaining the whole Jesus story, like who Jesus is, why he came, how much he loves us, the whole thing, like beginning to end. 11 chapters. And then he gets to chapter 12, and basically the idea from that point on is, okay, so this is how you should respond to everything that I've just written, right? And here's what he says. Here's the practical application. Here's where you start. He says, don't conform to the pattern of this world, like the norm, what everyone else is doing, right? And so if you're like me, you read that and you're like, okay, well, what does that mean? You know, don't dress like everyone else, don't talk like everyone. What does that mean? And then he clarifies in the next part. He says, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. This is where he's saying not to conform to the patterns of thinking that may have become the norm in society. And so following Jesus, this whole thing, it doesn't start by like trying to obey the rules. It actually starts by changing the way that you think, breaking the unhealthy patterns of thinking that may also be undermining the relationships in our lives. And so, the first pattern of thinking we're going to talk about in the time that we have left today. To introduce this idea to you, I want to show you a picture of this girl. You might have seen this picture before. Ready? Okay, this girl's known as Disaster Girl. All right, little girl, probably about 4 or 5 years old. She's looking at the camera with this devious look, and behind her, there's a picture of a burning building, a burning home. This has become an internet meme. If you're not sure what that is, basically it's a picture that just spreads virally throughout the internet. And what people will do is basically try to write their own story and attach it to the meme. Or it's one thing people do with memes, right? So you kind of write your own story. You fill in your blanks, right? So I found this. One person wrote this. There was a spider. It's gone now, right? Another person wrote, you don't have to clean your room if there is no room. Found another one that said, if they had a Steelers flag, Eagles. Not anymore. So you kind of write your own stories, fill in your own blanks, right? Interesting. The idea clearly here is that the girl burned down the house. What's interesting to know, I guess maybe, is that this girl, her name is actually Zoe. She's in her 20s now. She's a student at UNC, and when she was 4 years old, on her block, the local fire department was conducting a controlled burn for the sake of training their firefighters. And so her dad took her out to go see it, and he happened to snap a picture of her when she looked back at him, and the picture made it to the internet, and now it's a meme. But there's a real story behind all these stories that people have written. Here's my question for you. What kinds of stories do you tend to write for the people in your life? When there are blanks that you have to fill, when you have to figure out why someone did what they did or what they're gonna do, what kind of stories do you write? Maybe your picture is not of a little 4-year-old girl outside a burning building. Maybe it's a picture of your spouse, your significant other, comes home later than expected. It's the story you write. Doesn't care about the family. Or maybe the person you live with is upset with you again. It's the story you write. She's just an egg. Your kids are in a bad mood, giving you attitude. How do you fill in the blank? They're ungrateful. They don't appreciate everything we do for them. You've got a friend that votes a certain way. It's not the way you vote. What's the story that you write? Well, they're just one of those. She tags you in a picture. You don't like the way you look. She knew I didn't like the way I look. She's just trying to embarrass me. What are the stories that you write about people when you don't know why or you don't know what's going to happen? The first pattern of thinking that we're talking about is something we call cynicism. Cynicism is the idea of seeing, expecting, believing, assuming the worst in and about, specifically and especially, people. People. Several years ago, I was working in another church, and without going into the details, there was this guy that wanted to do something that was going to be a big distraction and really didn't fit in with what we were trying to do as the leadership of the church, and he started to get all bent out of shape, and somebody came up to me, one of my friends came up to me, and her name's Felicia. She used to be on the team here, actually, and she was like, just kind of asking, like, oh, so how do you feel about this, whatever, what are you guys going to do? And I just very quickly, naturally, just said, what, this guy, he wants to be the center of attention. And not in a judgmental way, but kind of like in a have you thought about it like this type of way. She said, well, maybe, or maybe that's genuinely what he thinks the best way to worship is. Maybe he's like genuinely just trying to do the right thing. It feels like he can't do what he's supposed to do. And when she said that, I replied sarcastically and was like, oh yeah, it made me feel horrible or whatever. But I walked away and I thought about it a lot. And it started to ask myself, like, when did I start assuming the worst? Like, when did I start seeing the bad in people? Expecting, assuming, believing that they've got horrible motives. It's about them. Their self-interest. This is the idea behind cynicism. When there's a story that needs to be written or a story that can be written, and we write the worst possible story, we fill in the blanks with the worst possibility. Cynicism, it's becoming a bigger and bigger thing, like a larger and larger problem. In 1964, there was a survey done in our country, and they found that 77% of Americans believed that the government, not one party, but the government as a whole, would do the right thing most of the time. 77%. Today, that percentage has dropped to 24%. And you might be sitting there thinking like, well, it's because the government has gotten like worse or whatever. But what's interesting is that this same idea applies to so many other institutions in society. And what's interesting about this is that the same kind of research is being done like all throughout this time period. And what they find over and over and over again is that the average person tends to assume that people are less trustworthy than they actually are. In 2009, there was an experiment done where they took this large group of people and they set them up. They put them in a situation where they had to choose whether to do the right thing or not. And then they took another group of people and they had them estimate, how often do you think people are going to do the right thing? And the average answer was about 50%. But in reality, people did the trustworthy thing 80 to 90%. In other words, like we are unnecessarily cynical. We see the worst and we're inaccurate. The ancient cynics, cynicism has been around for a long, long time, over 1,000 years. And the ancient cynics actually had a lot in common with the early Christians. But the ancient cynics are not like cynics today. The ancient cynics, they made a habit of withholding judgment. Like they asked questions. And so, you know, if the common belief was that you should eat candy for breakfast because it's good for you, the cynics would come along and they would say, hold on a second, maybe we should look into that a little bit. They were curious. And so they try to find out for themselves. And sometimes they would find out that it's not healthy to eat candy for breakfast. And so they wouldn't. But over time, you can probably see how this happened. Over time, they got a reputation for just rejecting the norm. And today, to be cynical, you can look it up. It simply means to assume the worst in people, to assume that people are motivated by their own selfish interests. So when we're talking about being cynical, we're not talking about withholding judgment. We're actually talking about declaring someone guilty before they have a chance to take the stand. Right? Maybe your significant other didn't come home late because they don't care about the family. Maybe they came home late because they do care about the family. Right? Maybe she didn't tag you in the picture because she wanted to make you look bad. Maybe she tagged you in the picture because she wants you to feel left out. Maybe your kids aren't ungrateful and disrespectful. Maybe they're being torn up by something that's happening at school. But maybe, if you're like most people in society, we are too quick to finish the story. Too quick. And you know this, it's hurtful, it's not helpful. Like I told you, I've been on the giving end of cynicism. I've also been on the receiving end. One time a few years ago, somebody walked into my office. They wanted to talk, they set up a meeting, they sat me down, they were like, all right, what's the deal? I was like, I don't know, what's the deal? And this guy looked at me, he said, do you hate my guts? I was like, no. It turns out the guy had stopped coming to the church that I was working at the time. He hadn't been there for months. And he said that he walked past me one Sunday. I was talking to someone else. And he said, you gave me a look that made me feel like I was the last person in the world you wanted to see. And I told him, I was like, look, you know, for me, I talk to people for like 15 seconds at a time, especially on a Sunday. And sometimes in those 15 seconds, people tell me some really bad news. You know, tell me about a diagnosis or something that they lost or something they're struggling with, like real quick. I'm like a magnet for bad news. And what I can't do is hear someone share their heartbreak and look at you and give you a Disney World smile in the middle of that conversation. So I don't remember, but it's possible that that's what happened. It's hard. It's hard and it's hurtful when people assume the worst. The issue with cynicism, though, is that it feels right when we're feeling cynical because it's the product of an experience. People aren't born cynical. Kids aren't cynical or really can't be cynical until about 7 or 8 years old. It happens when you've been burned, right? If you think about the people in your life that you're cynical of, or at least the people that you assume the worst of, or the situations when you tend to assume the worst about certain people, it's probably in a situation where you've been hurt before. It's the product of our pain. And so, in essence, what we do is, like, if I think you're gonna let me down, right? If I've prepared myself for you to let me down, I won't be hurt when you do. And so we choose to see the worst almost as a way of beating pain to the punch. If I assume you didn't text me back because you don't care about me, if I find out you don't care about me, I won't be so hurt because I knew it already. It's a defense mechanism. It's why cynical people are often described as hard. It's like scar tissue that's formed. It creates a world of problems. When you see yourself or people being defensive, that's a sign of cynicism. They're protecting themselves from pain. When you see someone being divisive or when you see division, it's a sign of cynicism. You're trying to break away from that pain. Or disconnected in a relationship, it's a sign of cynicism. You're disconnecting from a source of pain. Distant, disconnected, divisive. When you see that, it's often a sign of cynicism. And it creeps into our relationships and poisons them. I mean, so I told you earlier about the guy that I was assuming wanted to be the center of attention, right? If I have a conversation with that guy, and we've got to address that issue, just think about how different my approach is going to be. If I go into that conversation believing that he has selfish motives, right? What's my tone going to be like? What am I going to try and get him to understand? What's the goal of that conversation? Versus if I go in there at least open to the possibility that maybe he was just doing what he believed was the right thing to do. Then it's a redirection instead of a correction. It's a totally different conversation, and the same is true in our relationships. If you assume your significant other, they ignored you or they didn't show up when they said, if you assume the worst, you write your own story, your approach to that conversation is gonna be totally, totally different. It tears us apart. And on a larger level, as a community, as a church, as a country, there are some major issues that we are not equipped to handle unless we first handle cynicism. Things like the harsh, like the hostile political divide in our country. It's the product of cynicism, whatever side you're on. Because if you don't believe what I believe, you don't vote the way, I just assume you're A, B, C, and D. I've written my story about you. I've declared you guilty before you've had the chance to take the stand. So it creeps in, destroys us, it rots our relationships. So what do? Just like hope for the best. Don't lock your doors. Don't assume the worst. There's an approach that we see throughout the New Testament in different places, and if we'll kind of take pieces of the puzzle and put them together, it gives us a pretty clear solution to cynicism. There's no like, thou shalt not be cynical, because cynicism wasn't out yet. There's no word for it. But there are some things that we can do. The first idea, the first principle is simply to own it. You can call it confession, call it whatever you want. Simply to recognize I can be cynical. It's amazing how just saying that can give you a sense of awareness and make you maybe go back and rewrite a story that you've already written. There's a few other things, though, to break this pattern. Apart from owning it, the first thing we can do is simply be curious. Curiosity. James was the brother of Jesus. He grew up with him, which is probably interesting. And Later on in life, James writes a letter to a bunch of different churches that obviously a lot of different people have read, and he says this. He says, like, specifically, he says, my dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Don't forget this. Write this down. He says, everyone should be quick to listen. Quick to listen. That's abnormal. It's not like the pattern of this world. Quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. When you're angry, it's because you've already written the story, right? You've already decided why. But if we're curious, if we're simply like the ancient cynics, like simply saying, oh, I don't know why that happened. I don't know why he did that. I don't understand why she said that, why he said that. And so I'll just withhold judgment. And then be quick to listen. You'd be amazed to find out what you find out, simply by being curious. From there, after being curious, we can be compassionate. Like, this is a step beyond curiosity. You know why? Because sometimes you're going to be cynical. You're going to assume the worst, and you're going to be right. And then what do? Say, okay, see? And you like dig your roots deeper into your cynicism and close them off, disconnect. Or maybe there's a reason why. There's an instance with Jesus and his disciples. He came across this woman at a well. She was from a place called Samaria. And Jesus' followers did not like that place, and they didn't like people from that place because they believed that they were polluting their faith. They saw them as like these immoral, toxic people to what they believed. And Jesus went up to her and spoke to her. And they were surprised because he's speaking to this person that they believe is doing all these immoral things. And Jesus spoke to her, and you know what they found out? They found out she had been married like 7 times, and she was living with someone who she wasn't even currently married to. So she was cheating on the person she was with, and she's been with all these other people. And all of Jesus' followers had every right to be like, see? This is why we don't talk to those people. They're claiming to believe what we believe, and yet they're, dragging our whole thing through the mud here. But Jesus took it a step further and showed some compassion and explained to her, like, okay, really what's going on is that there's a need that's not being met within you. There's a thirst that you need to be quenched. Like, there is something going on. And he ends up getting through to her because he didn't just stop and say, see, okay, yeah, they said I shouldn't talk to you, and I went against my better judgment. But he was compassionate. And this is what you need when they say they're going to be home at 6, and you know they're not going to show up at 6, and then they don't show up at 6. Then what? Then you say, I told you so. This is why I'm cynical. This is why we have problems. Or can you stop and say, okay, what's going on here? Like, why is this an issue? No matter what the issue is, what's going on beneath the surface? And then lastly, courage. Courage. Why? Because it takes courage to be vulnerable. And if you're not going to disconnect and close yourself off from someone who's hurt you, there's a chance that you'll be hurt again. I'm not talking about reckless vulnerability. I'm not saying that you should intentionally put yourself in a situation where you know you're going to be harmed. That's not what I'm saying here. But I'm talking about our relationships with people that we have. Like the people we're rubbing shoulders with on a regular basis, where they do that thing and it make you feel that way and you want to just disconnect and push them away. But instead, you take a step in their direction, knowing that it could happen again. Knowing that they may do that again. I think this is what Jesus meant when he said, turn the other cheek. Not literally go around looking to just get slapped around by everybody, but recognizing that, okay, for this to work, one of us has to bridge the gap. And Jesus, over and over and over again, was the one who bridged the gap. He put himself in situations where he could get burned, and he consistently got burned. He let people walk all over him. But his closest friends, one of them betrayed him, another one denied him, and they all abandoned him. But he came back for them. Why? Because he believed that people were worth it. And as the church, if you consider yourself a follower of Jesus, if you're a person of faith, like this is what we've been invited to do. To continue to pursue people, even when there's a chance that we may get hurt. Even when they've hurt us in the past. Because we believe that people are worth it. People are worth it. So if we want to break this pattern of cynicism, we have to be curious. Just recognize you may not know and you don't need to. So maybe you ask. Be compassionate when they prove you right. When you assume the worst and you're right. And be courageous. Be willing to be stepped on. Have your toes stepped on, at least, for the sake of people. I'm going to ask the band to come back up here. We're going to wrap up, but here's the idea that I want to leave you with. So I got hurt a little while ago. Some of you know if you've been here. I've made a real big deal about it. It's been a big show. Had a brace, crutches, limping around. The truth is I actually didn't get hurt. No, I'm just kidding. That's not true. So, yeah, I got hurt. I was playing basketball. Tore my meniscus, a partial tear, and then MCL, and the other tendon. There was also this, cyst, Baker's cyst that ruptured in my knee all at once. It was, extremely painful, okay? Now you know my medical history. And it was really painful. At first, we didn't know what happened, but because that thing had ruptured, my knee was really swollen. I didn't want anyone to touch it. I didn't want to move it. I didn't want people to look at it. It was everything hurt. And so I was going from one doctor to the next, the first day that happened, trying to figure out, okay, what do I have to do here? And I get to this doctor who's, going to hopefully give me some answers, send me for an MRI. And after he checks everything out, I didn't want to put my foot on the table. Everything hurt when it happened. He looks at me when he's done and he says, all right, you've got to take some time over the next couple days to intentionally move your leg. You've got to put yourself in a situation that's going to be uncomfortable, or some scar tissue is going to develop, and your knee's not going to be the same. So it's not what I wanted to hear. It was hard. It was difficult, especially for the first few days after that, to continually put myself in a situation that was uncomfortable. But I did it because I didn't want scars to develop. That's the picture I want to leave you with. Are there some relationships in your life where some scar tissue has developed? Or are there certain situations in your relationship where some scar tissue has developed? Maybe you've got to take some time, make yourself uncomfortable, to get in there, move it around. Though it would be easier to just push it to the side and pretend it never happened. To engage that. Because people are worth it. These relationships are worth it. And cynicism is a pattern that's worth breaking.